Oh! Oh my God!
So this incident happened 2 years ago. I was driving home late Monday night, coming from a friend's house. It was well past midnight, and although it was a beautiful, clear night with a full moon to light up the road, I still hated driving this late. At least I have a road to myself, I said out loud. I had driven the road hundreds of times to and from college, but I still got that eerie feeling whenever I was this late. I live in West Virginia, and the road is full of twists and turns over cliffs and through forested areas. During the day it was a beautiful drive, but at night it was a nightmare. Anyway, I was about halfway back to my house when suddenly my car cut off. Luckily there was a small mom-and-pop store close by, and I was able to drift off the road and into its parking lot. I put it in the park and let it sit for a minute or so. My car does this sometimes, and most of the time it kicks back to life after a quick rest. However, tonight it did not. I pulled out my cell phone and flipped it open, but it didn't light up. I sat in my car and silently cussed to myself. It was at least a couple of miles to the next house, and I wasn't sure if I would be greeted with understanding or the barrel of a gun in my face when I knocked. Still, I got out and started walking. I hadn't taken 5 steps away from my car when I saw a light. It was a car up ahead. I quickly ran to the side of the road and tried to flag them down. I watched as the car passed me by. The car didn't stop, so I kept walking. A few minutes later I heard a loud noise. From the sound I assumed it was an accident. I ran over to my trunk and grabbed a small emergency kit I kept. I took out the flashlight and ran to where I heard the sound. I shone the light all over the side of the road, which ended over the side of a cliff into woods 30 feet below. I looked for what seemed like hours, but I couldn't see anything. No lights from the car below, no tire tracks leading off the road, and I couldn't even see any gravel move to suggest any living creature was anywhere other than me. I decided to try my phone again and call 911. I turned back to my car when I heard him. Someone was crying out below for help. His voice was weak, and I could tell he was in pain. I shone the light back below, but could still see nothing. I heard him calling out again, and I replied, "Hold on, I'm calling 911, help is on the way." I yelled and quickly ran back to my car. I picked up my phone, silently praying that it would work. This time, as I flipped it open, I was blinded by the bright screen. I quickly dialed 911 and explained through heavy breathing what had happened. It took them a little over 10 minutes to get there, and all the while I could faintly hear the man calling back out from over the cliff. I yelled into the cliff that help was on the way, but there was no reply. I waited for about 10 minutes and help was finally there. The police and paramedics searched the area for an hour before calling it off. There was no sign of the man calling back, no sign of the car that had gone over the cliff, no sign of any other car but mine. I explained everything that had happened to the cops, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was pranking them and I was threatened with being arrested. But one of the cops said it wasn't worth it and got the others to leave. I spoke with him a while longer and asked why he believed in me. He sighed and started telling me the story. About a year ago, there was a car accident right where we were. However, no one was around to call for help. Both passengers, a husband and wife, survived the crash but were badly injured. The husband tried to get help and even crawled back up onto the road before he came to his injuries. The next morning, a car saw his body and pulled over to call 911, but sadly it was too late for both of them. The officer had been called out before with similar circumstances and had found nothing. He told me to go home and try to get some rest, and that he would make sure I didn't get in trouble for the call. I thanked him and got back into my car. This time, the engine fired up as soon as I turned the key, and I quickly backed out and made my way home. But as I drove away, I again heard the man's voice cry out for help, but I sped out of there never looking back. This incident is the only paranormal incident of my life, and I am sure I will not forget this for the entire of my life. I had an incident that happened about a year ago that scared the hell out of me. For privacy reasons, the most I can tell you is that it happened in Indiana. Before I tell you about the incident, I need to explain why my best friend's grandparents' neighborhood has always spooked me. My best friend's name is Steve. Steve's grandparents lived about 25 minutes out of town. There are probably about 10 houses in the area. Each house is surrounded by ominous-looking trees. The jagged branches stick out like they are hands reaching out for you. It's kind of a swampy area with very little lighting around. The lack of lighting makes everything invisible in the woods surrounding the houses. A while ago there was a man who was tied to a chair in an abandoned house and someone set the house on fire. I was skeptical when Steve told me about it, but even his grandparents told me the same thing. One day while driving to his grandparents' house, he showed me the burned remains of the house. As if that didn't give off enough bad vibes, a lady hung herself in her front yard after sending her kids to school one day. There happens a lot of creepy incidents in that neighborhood. So Steve had been staying at his grandma's house for about a week because his grandparents were visiting relatives in Arkansas. This provided the perfect chance to drink and do what we wanted. Now that you got the backstory, I'll get to what happened. Well, one night Steve texted me and asked if I wanted to come over and hang out. It was late November and a little after 10:30. It was late, but I'm a bit of a night owl, so I didn't mind. I told him to give me a few minutes and I headed over to his grandma's house, assuming that he was still at his grandma's. I started heading that way. I drove to his grandma's house and realized all the lights inside the house were off. Confused, I took out my phone and texted Steve where he was, but he texted me back that he was at his own house. I literally drove out there thinking he was at his grandma's place. I sighed and got into my car to head to his house. I began to head back and then my phone rang. It was Steve. I answered it and he began to talk about a girl he likes. I stopped at a four-way stop and listened to Steve ramble on and on. I sat there for some time listening to Steve. I looked up to finally turn left and saw something. It appeared to be a shadow in the front yard of an old house. I had no clue someone even lived there. The shadow was very close to the road. I thought he was probably wondering why the hell I was just sitting here at the stop sign. My car radio showed that I had been stopped at the stop sign for about 5 minutes, so I could imagine I seemed sketchy. I began to turn my car left. My headlights illuminated the shadow and I saw something strange. My headlights revealed an old lady standing there with her hands folded as if praying. She was looking down and her mouth was moving quickly. I couldn't make out anything she was saying at all. Her mouth was just moving and she seemed like she was in a trance. She was probably 5 feet away from my car. I sat there and stared. It was probably 10 degrees outside and all that she was wearing was a gray dress. My headlights were directly on her and she didn't even look up. I didn't know what to do exactly. At first, I was concerned for the old lady, but the more she stood there, the more the hairs stood on the back of my neck. Steve realized I hadn't said anything for a few minutes. He asked me if I was still there and I told him that an old lady was standing and praying right by the road. He was surprised too and asked me if she was okay. I told him she looked almost possessed by the way she was standing there. I was afraid if I drove through she might run in front of my car. She had not even looked at me, so I tried to drive past her slowly. I hit my brakes slightly, afraid that she would run out in front of me. As I slowly started driving by, she was inches from my passenger window. She didn't budge. Her mouth never quit going either, never even acknowledged me. I still couldn't hear what she was muttering, but I didn't want to roll my window down to find out. Steve spoke into the phone and he seemed worried. He asked me where I was and I replied that I was at the four-way stop right by your grandma's house. After my reply, he panically shouted saying that at the same house, a lady had hung herself and no one lives in that house now. After hearing that, my stomach sank and I smashed the gas pedal. I drove about 80 until I got close to town. I was so scared that my voice became shaky on the phone. When I arrived at Steve's, I told him everything I saw. We were both in disbelief and I became very nervous. I stayed at his house for 2 nights. I had trouble sleeping alone after that incident. As of now, there is nothing more to add to the story. Whether it was the lady's ghost, a spirit, or just some weird old lady who decided to pray by the road at midnight in 10-degree weather, it scared the shit out of me. So my name is Bob and this incident happened about a year ago when I was going to my mom's house. This incident has been haunting me till now and I am still afraid to drive alone. So I was driving to my mother's house. She lived far out of the city and in a highly forested area. There were no street lights and not a lot of houses. If there were houses, they were built back into the forest with long winding driveways before any sign of life. So I was a late teenager driving back to my mother's home in the late evening. As I was driving, something up ahead on the road caught my eye. It was a small bundle next to the road, and as my car passed the bundle, I was shocked. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. I smashed the brakes, stopping 50 meters up the road. I reversed back a little and then jumped out of the car as quickly as I could. Thinking that someone had abandoned a baby on the road, I ran over to the bundled up blanket and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was just a toy baby. Just as I had picked up the baby, I saw headlights coming down the road in front of me. Suddenly realizing I was standing on the road alone at night, I ran quickly back to my car and drove off. To my surprise, the car behind moved up, coming up close to the back of my car and tooting its horn at me. I was panicking. I started driving faster and faster, constantly checking my rearview mirror. Although I couldn't see who was in the car behind me, eventually, I reached my mother's driveway, which was still about 2 kilometers long. My mother lived deep in the forest. I thought to myself that if the car followed me down the driveway, I would call my mother and tell her to ring the police. As I turned onto the driveway, the car behind me also turned into the driveway, still very close behind. I kept thinking back to the baby toy and how creepy the evening had been. I got out my phone and called my mother. I told her that I was being followed and asked her to call the police. I was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. The car was still following very close, and both cars were going way too fast for the type of road and no streetlights. I could see nothing but what was being lit by my headlights and the headlights of my pursuer. Then I saw my mother's house in the distance. The car was still beeping the horn so loudly that my ears rang. As I got to the house, I jumped out of the car. My mother was standing at the front of the house waiting for me with a kitchen knife in her hand. I ran up to her as quickly as I could. The car that was following also stopped and the doors of the car flew open. An elderly couple jumped out of the car and were yelling and pointing to my car. "Someone got into your car," they screamed. As I was realizing what had happened, a man jumped out of the back seat of my car and ran into the forest. Everyone just looked at each other in shock as I realized what had just happened. The car coming down the road had seen someone jump into my car when I stopped to check on the baby. The car behind was chasing me to tell me that someone was in my car. It was most likely that the guy in my car had left it there on the road watching for people to stop, taking advantage of people's kindness. I thanked the couples and they left. To think about that incident, it still creeps me out and I still fear driving alone on that road. Since that incident, whenever I drive alone, I don't stop the car no matter what I see.